Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to Salesforce. I'm Tim Christopherson. I lead our climate and nature action here at Salesforce. Welcome to our London Tower. There's about 3,000 square meters of solar panels on the roof, helping us to keep the energy consumption down. This building also has about 30% less water usage than office buildings of similar size. Just wanted to welcome you to this event of London Climate Action Week, and what better first topic to discuss than forests. Thank you for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedules. At Salesforce, we focus on 4 sustainability areas. The first is our net zero journey. We have a 50% absolute reduction target by 2030. Well on track to reach that. We also require all our suppliers to have a Paris-aligned climate target. The second area we focus on is nature. I'll say a bit more about that later, and how and why we invest in forests, amongst others. Our third area is the ecopreneur revolution. So supporting anybody who wants climate action not only to be their passion, but their full-time job. And we've helped about 50,000 ecopreneurs to be connected and elevate their top innovations, together with the World Economic Forum and Deloitte since 2020. Companies like Silvera, Carbon Rating Agency, and other top innovators came out of Uplink. Last but not least, we also focus on the energy transition. We've reached 100% renewable energy across our own operations. We've made a lot of investments in wind and solar in some of our jurisdictions. And importantly, across all these topics, we focus on advocacy, because to reach our climate target, the world also has to make progress. Other companies have to make progress who are in our scope 3 emissions. So advocacy for us is an essential part of taking climate action. And that leads us back to why it's important to take jurisdictional approaches for forest conservation. So we couldn't be more pleased to host the Leaf Coalition and the Emergent team here for this event. And with that, over to Aaron, who's the CEO of Emergent.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, and welcome everyone. What an amazing way to start the first morning of London Climate Action Week. So big thanks, Tim, to you, the whole Salesforce team. Quick round of applause for you guys. Full room, what a beautiful view, and of course, such an important topic. So I've got the great privilege to introduce you to our first speaker, who has been in the market for over 30 or close to 30 years. But before we do that, a quick overview of what the run of show looks like. We're gonna have opening remarks, and then we have a really fantastic panel. Oh, they were up here earlier, but we've got a fantastic panel. And then, there we are. So I'll introduce the panel when we get to it. But we're looking to have this also be dynamic. Everyone in here is an expert in these markets. We also want to hear from you. We want to have a dynamic dialogue after the panel. So thank you again, Salesforce. Thank you also to the NCS Alliance, Julia Carbone, who's going to be on our panel, and also the UK government. So we're really thrilled to host this today. So with that, we all know that integrity in voluntary carbon markets is paramount. And the work that our next speaker has been doing on bringing integrity to the market has been absolutely crucial at the VCMI. And so here to tell us more about the work that they're doing, what to expect into the future, and how that relates to the topic of the day, which is protecting forests, is Mark Kember. So Mark, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Aaron. I was going to speak from the lectern because I had some slides, but the tech guy told me that there's a air conditioning sweet spot just here. So I'm going to start here. So, and I may go back to there if I forget what I was going to say. So, as Aaron said, I'm Mark Kember. I run the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. Many of you will know there are 2 such organizations, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I'm going to do this joke again. So there's the People's Front of Integrity and the Integrity's People's Front, depending if those of you old enough to remember Life of Brian will remember what that means. But 2 organizations that are trying to deal with an issue that I'm sure you're all aware of, that many of us believe that while the ideal solution in 2024, given that we have been negotiating climate change now for 36 years. Remember, international climate negotiations started in 1988. We knew about the greenhouse gas problem over 100 years ago. The fact that we are standing here in 2024, when emissions in 2023 were 1.1% higher than in 2022. Those of you will have seen energy reports last week that emissions, CO2 emissions from the energy consumption exceeded 40 billion tons for the first time ever last year. So we are not on track. And the fact that we are talking about voluntary carbon action, voluntary action investments, whether they be in jurisdictional approaches like Leaf Promotes or any other, the fact that we're talking about voluntary action is a sign of our collective failure. And I think it's important to say that because we're talking about markets that are small, that can have transformational catalytic effects, but they are not a substitute, and they're not a substitute in the long term by any means for policy-driven action covering every company in every sector in every country in the world. And I think it's important to say that because often when we talk about carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets in particular, people have a sense that perhaps we're suggesting that we don't need regulation, we don't need policy, and voluntary investments will save the day. Well, we've tried that for 36 years and it's clearly not working. However, we also need to start from where we are and not where we should be or where we'd like to be. We'd like emissions to have been reduced by 30 or 40% already, and then we've got a gentle glide path to net zero in 2050. Sadly, that's not the case. So we do now have to take advantage of every single tool in our toolkit. We know that countries in 2009 promised $100 billion in investment for mitigation and adaptation in the developing world. We may just have reached that 13 years late in 2022. So we're not reducing emissions. We don't have enough finance. And this is where voluntary corporate action and voluntary investments through carbon markets can play a crucial role. But anyone who's been paying this market over the last 25 years or so that I've been working on it will have seen that demand and supply go up and down and up and down. And we're now, sadly, in one of those troughs. Troughs caused by a lack of trust in the market, broadly speaking. Trust because people don't believe that carbon credits really represent a permanent, real, additional, robustly quantified ton of carbon. And lack of trust because people tend to believe that companies that are using carbon credits are in some way cheating or in some way greenwashing. And I would argue that over the last couple of years, partly in response to that crisis, that is certainly changing. So the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market set very, very high standards. And there are a number of people, including Julia and I, who are on the board of the ICVCM, who know just how difficult it has been to find the right methodologies for the right project types, for all those things that we need to invest in. And obviously today we're talking about specifically about protecting forests, avoiding deforestation. And that is and will continue to be one of the most difficult areas to find credible methodologies, assure long-term permanence, and so on and so forth. But that cannot be a reason not to do it. We know, and I'm sure you'll hear this many times today, that 30% of all the emission mitigation solutions need to come from the nature sector, from protecting forests, restoring natural ecosystems. So we can't say, just because it's a bit difficult, or because there's been the odd project where things haven't worked out, that we just forget about it. Because forgetting about it is 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees of warming. So we need to start from a perspective of how do we ensure integrity on that supply side of the market? How do we ensure that those credits that you and others are buying represent as close to a real ton of emissions mitigation as possible? And I say as close to as possible because, so I'm shifting out of the air conditioning, sorry, Julia. We're as close to as possible because it will never be perfect. And I think that's message number one from today. And I hope Erin and others on the panel would agree with that, that if every ton of emissions reduction, ton of emissions removal has to be perfectly quantified, has to be permanent, meaning for thousands of years, has to admit no error whatsoever, then again, we may as well forget about it. What the Integrity Council and my organization, the VCMI, are trying to do is get to a point where you and all stakeholders can say, yes, that's good enough. That's worth investing in because the benefit that these projects deliver is far greater than doing nothing. And I think to the corporates in the room, I would say that's one of the challenges we have at the moment. For many of you, and I speak to many companies every week, they say, actually, at the moment, it's better to do nothing. If I have a science-aligned or a science-based target and I don't meet it, nobody says anything. I shrug my shoulders and I say, I tried, sorry. Whereas if I stand up and I say, I've done my absolute best, but I haven't made my target and I'm buying some carbon credits to go above and beyond, then you're risking being called out in the press. You're risking appearing on a television program. You're risking being shouted down by NGOs who are, with well-meaning, good sense, scrutinizing the projects, but we're finding a problem that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So for those of you who are thinking about the voluntary carbon market, investing in the sort of projects that Leif will be talking about later, be brave, because your bravery is needed if we're going to address the climate problem. So just to touch for a moment on VCMI. The ICVCM side of it looks at what are high integrity standards for carbon credits. VCMI addresses the other part of the problem that I mentioned, that companies are scared. They're scared that if they do it wrong, they'll be called out for greenwashing. They'll be called out for evading their responsibilities, despite the fact that evidence over the last year, 2 or 3 different pieces of research have showed that companies that are using carbon credits, including, I suspect, many in this room, are actually those that are decarbonizing faster. They have more ambitious targets. They're more likely to be addressing all 3 scopes of their emissions. They're more likely to be invested in low carbon technology development in the future. And they're more likely to be managing climate change at the board level. But what we want to do at VCMI is make it clear to companies and the broader public how to do it well. And if you use carbon credits well as part of a broader net zero transition strategy, you should be rewarded for it. Whereas those who don't do it well should be excluded from the game. And that's to make it clear to those that want to take action that they don't have to be ridiculously brave. They don't have to risk their reputations. They're doing it well and they're going to be rewarded for it. So just last week, a company called Natura, which many of you will know, Latin America's largest cosmetics company, made the 2nd ever carbon integrity claim. A carbon integrity claim is a claim developed under VCMI's Claims Code of Practice. And it's a 4-step process where companies first have to meet some foundational criteria or prerequisites, demonstrate that they have net zero commitments, demonstrate that they're making progress towards their short and long-term targets, demonstrate that their advocacy activities are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And once they've demonstrated they're on track to their next target, so in Natura's case, for 2023, they have a trajectory which shows how they get from their base year to their interim target of 2030 for all 3 of their scopes. And they demonstrate with limited assurance that that is the case. And having done that, they then bought carbon credits, high quality carbon credits, consistent with the ICVCM's core carbon principles to cover all their remaining emissions. And therefore, they've shown that not only is carbon credits complementary, not a substitute for internal decarbonization, but they've driven real value from it because it establishes an internal price of carbon. They are getting better contracts. They're getting more clients, more customers, because they are showing that they are climate leaders, not only investing in every aspect of their supply chain, but also investing in going above and beyond, including in projects that avoid or reduce deforestation. So we have no time to wait. We can't say, oh, I'll just see how the market plays out in 5 or 6 years' time. Oh, I'll just wait until a major government around the world decides to put policy in place. We'll wait until the market seems a bit better, till inflation's gone down, till whatever it is. We can't. We know that. Emissions are growing. We need to invest in a whole range of activities that if we don't invest now, will disappear. Imagine Aaron having a conversation with a community who live in a forest. They need income, like all of us do. And they have a choice. They can either protect the forest and at the moment receive nothing, or they can chop it down, sell the logs, graze their cattle, and for a few years at least until the land no longer serves its purpose, make some money from that. Who would we be to say, hang on, don't chop down the forest, but wait 5 years or wait 10 years till we get some public finance or till we get some decent policy in place? Would you go up to a community living in subsistence levels and say, just hang on, live in poverty for a couple more years, another 10 years? I wouldn't be that person. Voluntary carbon finance through activities like those promoted by Leif are a way of providing an alternative, providing a revenue stream to people so they can protect the forest, so you restore the carbon, so we reduce the risks of climate change, while at the same time providing sustainable livelihoods. And that's why we need to do it now. Because if we wait 5 years, those opportunities will be stranded, those opportunities will be gone, and the emissions will be in the atmosphere. So finally, pay attention to the work that ICVCM and VCMI are doing. It's complex, it's difficult, it seems slow at times, but we're seeing a pipeline of companies who are using both the core carbon principles units and following VCMI guidance, and realizing that that provides a framework to follow the mitigation hierarchy, to decarbonize in line with the science, but also to go above and beyond and invest in the sorts of climate solutions, particularly nature-based solutions, that we know we all need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. We're all fortunate to have somebody so clear-eyed, visionary, and practical at the head of VCMI. So thank you. And look, what you said also really resonates. We know we're in the midst of a climate crisis, but also biodiversity and deforestation crisis. We're here, and this market is in service of solving large global challenges, not solving a big accounting challenge, right? We have to keep that in mind. So the accounting is important, integrity is important. It's in fact a requirement, but it's insufficient to solve and drive the market. And so thank you for your remarks. I'd like to invite the panel up now. So we've got as I mentioned, we've got a terrific panel for you. First, I'd like to invite Julia Carbone, who many of you will know as the director of Natural Climate Solutions Alliance at WBCSD. She's tirelessly worked on convening public and private stakeholders to boost demand for high integrity and nature-based climate solutions. So welcome,
Thank you,
Julia.
I see.
Next, we have Adele Kelly, who is Sustainability Partnerships and Strategy Director at GSK, which is thankfully a LEAF member. She's spent over a decade and is currently in the market and is currently responsible for GSK's approach to carbon credits, nature protection, and restoration activities. Welcome, Adele.
Thank you.
And last, but certainly not least, Tim Christofferson, who is our host today at Salesforce. He's the Vice President of Climate Action at Salesforce over the last 2 years. And before that, he led the Nature for Climate branch at UN Environment Program and spearheaded the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. So welcome all. Unfortunately, Juan Carlos ran into travel issues. Many of you know there's another event in Oslo happening concurrently, so unfortunately he won't be able to make it. Okay, so I want to get into the questions, but I thought what I would do first is provide a bit of context on why we're here. And so the question is, why forests? So we know for quite some time that there is no pathway to a safe climate. There's no pathway to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement without reducing and zeroing out deforestation. So deforestation is 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so there is no way to do that. And on the flip side, we have, in my view, a unique opportunity, in fact, I would argue an obligation, to solve this challenge. This is a challenge that doesn't require new technology for everything that's happening in the technology world. We've got the tools that we need. This is really a challenge that requires shifting of incentives, right? And so we can do this, right? We can get to zero deforestation by the end of this decade. So imagine a future in the not so far off distance where we've zeroed out deforestation and we've started the restoration of the planet. So this is doable. And carbon finance through voluntary carbon markets, we think can, in fact, must play an important role here to unlock the finance needed to shift those incentives. As we sometimes say, to make forests worth more alive than dead. Look, in my opinion, and that maybe this is controversial, in my opinion, the highest and best use of carbon finance is to protect and restore ecosystems. Why? First, they offer systemic solutions, right? When you talk about reversing deforestation, this is a global systemic solution. Second, they offer unique co-benefits, not only to the climate, but to biodiversity, to communities, into local environment. And third, I would say additionality. Right? Typically, standing ecosystems don't often have other sources of revenue. Right? They rely, in many cases, on support from selling ecosystem services, things like carbon, to keep them financially viable. So how do we do this? How can we get from where we are now to unlock this type of finance? And so this is where the LEAF comes in. But really what we need, in our view, is effective public-private partnerships. Right? There is not a single company, government, philanthropy that can do this alone. We need effective partnerships to move everyone in the same direction, and that's where LEAF fits in. So we designed LEAF from the bottom up. So for those of you who don't know, LEAF stands for Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. It's now a coalition of about 25 companies and 4 donor countries, US, UK, Norway, and Korea, who've come together and committed over $1 billion to pay forest countries who reduce deforestation and do a better job at protecting their forests. We built LEAF from first principles to harness public-private participation, and in recognition that integrity was really the key, the sort of key piece here. And so we built LEAF. First, we built Emergent as a nonprofit delivery, the delivery instrument for LEAF. We understood, right, that there needs to be transparency. There needs to be, we removed the profit motive, right? So all of this, the whole notion of Emergent as a nonprofit delivering LEAF was really important from the integrity piece. From what Mark was talking about, we also recognized that it was important to have buyer criteria to ensure that companies were not using carbon credits as a way to delay climate action, but to support climate action. So I think we were probably one of the first, if not the first initiative to implement buyer criteria. The third point is we also understand that the supply integrity is crucially important. And so we rely on the ART standard, the Architecture for Red Transaction standard, which we view as one of the highest, if not the highest, integrity standards out there. And lastly, we are exclusively focused on the jurisdictional approach. So so-called jurisdictional RED+. And we think that's important to drive scale and to solve some of the technical issues that have plagued some of the projects. So where are we now? Well, our ambition, well, first of all, we've signed the first transactions with Ghana and Costa Rica at COP in Dubai. And we're working on half a dozen transactions to get done this year. And our aim is to arrive in Belém, COP30, where importantly with a focus on Brazil and the Amazon states, but also other jurisdictions in Asia and Africa. And at that time we'll see credits flowing, we'll see payments made to forest communities. So I wanted to provide that context about LEAF and the issue that we're talking about today. Now I'd like to turn to our panelists. First, Julia, I think I'm turning to you first. So there we go. So there are many companies right at different stages of this journey. Can you give us an overview of the role of forests and the different approaches that are available to companies, and how they can be thinking about the different options that they have to support their climate and nature strategies?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I had to write down some notes because it's something that is so passionate for me, and I think for a lot of people, that there's so many things I like to say. So I hope I wanted to have a structure to convey the passion that many of us have. So why do we need forests? You already mentioned some of the elements, but I think I want to flip it. Why do we need to protect forests, right? And not let them disappear, and maybe one day have them back in 200 years, right? So the first message is 200 years from now is going to be way too late. So we know that nature recovers, right? If you leave it alone, we have seen a lot of situations where nature comes back, nature. Not the same forest that you had before, probably in a different composition, but some things will grow back. We have two issues here. One is that, first of all, we value biodiversity, and that biodiversity, which might never come back. And we have a timeline, which is 2030 and 2050. And there is no way a forest will grow back in that such a short time. This is so short for nature. Nature takes decades and 100 years to recover. So that, I think, is the biggest challenge we have, to say we lose something. Of course, there are good, ecosystem regeneration, restoration mechanism, but they will not be fast enough. If you look at, for example, if we start restoration now, and when we get the full, which is absolutely important, therefore, to invest in restoration today, but the full, let's say, volume and potential of restoration will come only in decades, and that will be too late. Now, forests that we have today are important for biodiversity, but also, as you said, are important for people. There are a lot of communities and indigenous peoples that are nature dependent. I'm saying dependent. Their livelihoods, their health, and their spiritual values lie in this forest, right? They disappear. There is not just about a forest. It's not just about nature and biodiversity. It's about the real, let's say, texture of life for a lot of communities. So how do we, and the final piece of information I wanted to add is that, based on this issue about when things can recover, so this is where the concept of irrecoverable carbon has come out, where there are going to be basically, out of what is available, what is already absorbed by forests, kept in the vault of forest, there are at least 130 gigaton of carbon that could get lost and that we will not recover, just because of what we were saying before. It will take so long to recover that by the time it's recovered, we are above any limit of temperature. So the question is, I don't think there is even a question anymore why we can't lose forests, right? Forests are important, but we cannot do without them. So the question, as you said, is the challenge is that everything has to be, if we have to make it perfect, it will just not work. As a society, we have to agree what is good enough for all of us in terms of supply and demand, right? In terms of, especially in this case, supply integrity. So the question, I think, from a perspective of how do we use the voluntary carbon market? Well, first of all, it's not the only solution to protect this forest, right? The recoverable carbon and all the actors of forest, none of us is saying that has only to be with the voluntary carbon market. There are a lot of other contributions, like supply chain, no deforestation commitments, for example, that will play a huge role. But it's like, we need everything right now. We are so, let's say the financing going to nature and nature for climate is so low that we can't, every dollar and every ton will count. So when we're looking at forests and how we do forest protection, specifically for voluntary carbon market, we have three main approaches, right? And one is project level, one is nested, or let's say the second one is jurisdiction, and the third one we'll say is nested, which is how a project stands into a jurisdiction. And they're similar in the sense in the aims. They're all about avoiding deforestation, right? Avoiding unplanned deforestation, but the actors are quite different. At the project level, you often have NGOs and communities directly responsible for delivering the activities, and they are within the limits of a project. While at the jurisdictional level, you have a system approach where the authority, the public authority, actually take a role. In my perspective, they are not supposed to be either or, right? They are supposed, in a jurisdiction, you have specific projects that can work within that, and there is a space for communities, there is a space for NGOs. And I think this is the challenge of how to make these two systems work together. I think jurisdiction, the promise of jurisdiction is that it will address some of the key challenges of REDD+ as a methodology, because there are issues related to how do you define the counterfactual baseline, right? When we are talking about avoided something, we are talking about comparing it to something that we don't, we are assuming will happen, but we are not absolutely sure. That's the whole point about, avoiding something. And working at the jurisdictional level gives you better data. It also gives you a little bit more, let's say, confidence about leakage and also about permanence. So these are the promises of jurisdiction, but I would say we should not, for this, completely forget about the project level actors, because they do play a role. And so I'm looking at Aaron because we have regular this discussion. It's like, it's not either or, it's about how do we bring project actors together into delivering at a system level change, which in this case is called jurisdiction. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we'll come back to you,
Yeah.
Julia. And thank you very much. And just to echo what you said, these three approaches, and I like the way you framed it: projects, jurisdictional, and nested approach. I think they all have their advantages, and they all have their role. And I think just to be clear with everyone, I mean, at LEAF, we're focused on a jurisdictional approach, but we also think there's an important role for projects. Look, the reason we've focused on jurisdictional is scale, and also it unlocks other tools that projects can't, specifically tools that the governments have, right? Tools around enforcement, tools around, let's say, tax policy, et cetera, right? I've spent 20 years in this market. I've probably developed or invested in over 40 projects, and I see the value in the projects. What we need ultimately is to move into this nested approach. There might be some bumps in that road getting there, but we can't remove any tools, in my view, off the table. So we need all of the above. But at its right, the fuel or the engine behind all this is the demand.
Yeah.
Right. Without the demand, we have nothing. Right. And so we've got two corporate voices here. Both happen to be partners in the LEAF Coalition. So Adele, I'd love to turn to you first from GSK. Well, an argument can be made that the entire global economy is based on nature and natural capital. So I'm curious on your perspective at GSK, the unique sort of challenges and opportunities that you see specifically related to the nature and climate agenda, and how you've approached that.
Great question. About 5 minutes to answer, so I'll do my best. Hi, everyone. Well, to start, as a biopharma company, GSK, taking action on climate and nature is quite fundamentally linked to our purpose. If you consider the negative impact that, as Julia alluded to, climate change and nature laws have on human health. So in 2020, we set for ourselves some ambitious goal on climate and nature, and the end is very important here. So just to set the context, on climate, we have a 2045 SBTi validated net zero target, but we also have a midway target in 2030. So what we want to do by 2030 is we want to reduce by 80% our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So quite an ambition challenge by itself. Now, what we also want to do is take responsibility for the 20% of emissions we cannot, abate through investment in nature and through carbon credits. Now, I want to share a bit our story, and we have thought very carefully about if and how enter the voluntary carbon market. I think we all know the challenges. It's a very risky space. Some of the challenges that Mark underlined before. But we thought about two key things. The first one is reduction is fundamental, but is not enough. Hopefully that's very clear for everybody today. But that was a key argument for us in 2020 to say, okay, we need to do everything we can to reduce and in parallel invest in nature and buy carbon credits. The second reason is that investing in carbon credits is fundamental for nature, climate, and people, as Julia said. So there is really a fantastic opportunity here to, for the voluntary carbon market to be a vehicle of moving capital where is most needed. So for these two reasons, we decided that despite the market was not perfect, it's still not perfect, despite so many amazing experts trying to improve it, but we decided not to exit or to lean back and say, actually, let's wait for it to be good. We decided to lean in and try, with our tools to help make it better, to help scale. So that's our approach. Now, how do we do that? We invest currently only in nature-based solutions, nature climate solution, because of the reasons that have been explained. We invest in early stage project. That's another important thing. So we currently don't buy from the spot market. We only invest in early stage project, but we do invest today capital. And the reason why we do this is because, first of all, by entering in early stage project, we hope we can really bring that challenging questions, that due diligence, and we can help a project through, of course, experts. We don't have that expertise directly, but we can help the project be higher quality. We can help the project from the get-go, considering nature, biodiversity, and people's health, not just climate. That's one intention. The second purpose is to help scale the market. We really hope that by investing in project now that will deliver credits later, there will be later on more high quality credits for everybody, not just for GSK. So maybe just thinking about challenges, well, so many. I think, I'm not gonna list them all, but clearly this is not easy, right? I don't want to make it sound it's easy, because it's not. We learn every day, we stay flexible. Sometimes things don't go as we planned. So there is, a lot of, doing things together, participating in different forums, and really helping each other learn and learn out loud so that we can all learn faster and move quicker. But there are also a lot of opportunities, and I would mention two. One is I think, the huge untapped opportunity of bringing nature and people's health into the voluntary carbon market. If we only look at the climate lens, we are really missing, billions of dollars that could deliver on other impact areas. And the second huge opportunity, and LEAF is a part of the solution here, is actually collective action. Exactly because there is so many risks in doing this, but also the potential for impact at scale is huge. If we come together, for example, through the LEAF Coalition or other collective action, we can really aim at reducing some of those risks and increasing the scale of that impact. So I think, no brainer. Just come and join us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Adelia. And look, I think your point about investing early stage, either through an investment or a forward offtake, is crucially important to provide that demand pull. Right? And I just want to recognize also the governments who are part of LEAF, US, UK, and Norway, who have collectively contributed about over $500 million in not forward commitments, because they're not buying credits, but basically they're saying we need to kickstart a market here. If this is going to be successful, we need to actually kickstart a private market here. And so their role is actually as a purchase guarantee, as buyers of last resort. So they say, if there is not another buyer that comes along by the time the credits are issued, we will pay, in our case, $10 per ton. And that is so important to really kick off the flywheel, to get things started, right? And then that provides supply for the market to build on in the future. So Tim, coming to you. Salesforce has been such a great leader in the space, and so same question to you: opportunities, challenges, but also how, I think it's important. There are other corporates also in the room. How do you think about the internal business case to actually spend real money on high integrity carbon credits? And then also, I also hope you can touch on, many in the audience will have seen that Salesforce was, the announcement that Salesforce was one of the founding members of Symbiosis, and I see Julia here. And so how do you think about LEAF, Symbiosis, reductions, removals? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And first of all, I want to reflect a little bit on how far we've come collectively, right? Many of us have worked on this topic for many years, and somebody told me 10 years ago we would be sitting in a corporate setting here in the center of London and discussing how companies can invest more and better in forests.
Yes.
I would have said that is success. That's what we're aiming for. So we're on the right path, and this is accelerating. I see more and more companies investing. There's new investment funds into nature about every week. A new one is closing. So there's a lot of accelerating momentum. You want to be part of that if you're a company, first of all, because it's all about critical mass in the private sector, right? You don't want to be the first one to do something, because that's very risky. But we've passed that. There's a group of people who've sort of bloodied their noses and got beaten up in The Guardian and elsewhere. So that has helped to improve the VCM. Let's be honest about that, because there was some bad quality both on the supply side. There was some questionable demand. And with the VCMI and ICVCM and many other efforts, we are past that. This is now a very mature market. Technology enables us to really see what these emission reductions and the removals are, where they are, how they're done. Will there be more hiccups in the future? Yes. Is it worth it? Absolutely. And in fact, I would say if any big company and any CEO in a climate crisis, you have to reduce your emissions. That's your top priority, but you also have to invest. And there's none of the 2,000 largest companies in the world who can tell me we only have money to do one of the two. That is not the case. If 10% of those companies would compensate some of their emissions on the VCM, it could generate $1 trillion by 2030. That's the money we urgently need, because right now it's the best thing we have. I agree with Mark. If we had implemented a global carbon tax 20 years ago, we wouldn't need to spend our time in London Climate Action Week. We could take a walk in the forest, but we didn't. And it's also unlikely that that will happen anytime soon. So we have to invest. What will happen soon, though, is that regulation will come in, force more companies to invest, force more companies to disclose. You've all heard of CSRD. And with that comes more scrutiny of what you do beyond reducing. So that's the internal business case. It's basically unavoidable now that you have to reduce and invest. If you don't do that yet, get ready to design a carbon credit portfolio as a company. And then it comes to the question, well, how do I invest? It's very confusing. There's avoided deforestation, there's planting trees, there's landfill gas projects. So obviously nature has a lot of co-benefits that other VCM projects don't have. We also invest in technology and CDR projects. So it's not, we don't only invest in nature, but clearly we invest in nature and in forest because of the many co-benefits. And I think that is something that is not in dispute. I get asked a lot also, there's avoided deforestation and there's removals credits. So, generating new restoration carbon projects. And again, we can do both. 10 years ago, maybe this was a zero-sum game. So it shouldn't be put all our money in conservation first. But it's now a bit like there's a patient being wheeled into the emergency ward with severe internal bleeding and the limb missing. And the doctors are arguing, well, should we stop the bleeding or should we give a blood transfusion? It's not a question anymore. We have to do both, and we have to do both at the same time and with everything we have. And that's why we're proud to have co-founded the Symbiosis Coalition that gave a 20 million ton offtake signal into the nature-based removals market. Julia Strong is here, who leads the Symbiosis Coalition. So if you have any difficult questions, please ask her. And at the same time, we have made a 2 million ton commitment under the LEAF Coalition and are a proud partner. Just want to make one more point why we should invest in jurisdictional RED. And going back to 2016, when I was working at UNEP at the time, we did a study with ODI looking at how much Brazil and Indonesia spent in domestic subsidies on expanding agriculture and other activities that were driving deforestation. It was 122 times more than they were getting money from Norway for reducing deforestation. So there was $1 billion here from Norway, and there was about 60 billion in Indonesia in internal subsidies to accelerate deforestation. So you cannot solve this by a project-by-project approach alone. There has to be political level lift, and there has to be a public-private partnership. Luckily, in many of those jurisdictions, a lot has shifted. There's something called the EU deforestation regulation now that limits what companies can import into the EU from deforestation areas. And those jurisdictions that have worked for the last 10 years almost, well, with the LEAF Coalition for 5 years or more, they have now a very good starting position to say, well, we can export more into the EU because we can clearly demonstrate we've reduced deforestation, we are ready to do business beyond the carbon market. And I think that is now a driver for more countries to come on board. On a final word on just saying thank you to all these beneficiary countries and the developing countries mostly that are part of going through this very rigorous and very lengthy process, safeguards, the monitoring, the verification. This is a very complex process, and it's costed a lot of staff time, and the rewards are only starting to accrue now. So it's very important that we give that signal that that whole journey is worth it for them. And luckily, many of them are starting to see that now.
Well, thanks, Tim. I think before we move to audience questions, so start thinking about your questions. We've got some microphones that'll be roaming. We're going to open up in just a minute for audience questions, but I want to ask one question to each of the panelists or however you guys want to handle it. But look, and I agree. We wouldn't have imagined however many years ago that we'd be sitting in this beautiful setting talking about forests in this corporate setting. That said, we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, and I think Mark alluded to it. The voluntary carbon market is still a very, very small market, especially for the amount of time, attention that's paid to it, and the hope that's given to it to help really drive climate action. It's a $2 to $3 billion market. For context, the compliance carbon market, we said, had we had a carbon tax, is approaching now $1 trillion market, right? So it's ordered of magnitude different. My favorite, I forgot to mention, I forget who, the U.S. pet food industry is a $64 billion market. So we need to massively scale this market if it's going to deliver on its promise. So what more needs to be done to get these funds flowing? And we don't have time, right? So in a reasonable time frame. We've heard from Mark on integrity. We think that's important. What more needs to be done? Julia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I can tell you what our priority in the NCS Alliance and the Forest Investor Club this year. We are really bringing together the buyers and investors in influencing private and voluntary, and compliance policies. And our priority will be on SBTI.
Mm-hmm.
Providing input to the SBTI process, which is the framework that most companies are using to understand what will be a socially acceptable new version that enables companies to take responsibility for all their emissions, right? Because right now, through the SBTI, you take responsibility for the emissions in line with, with your near-term and net zero targets, but there are still going to be remaining emissions on the journey in the transition to net zero. At net zero, you neutralize, so that's taken care of. But there is a big journey. That's the transition path, right? And we would like to push to have a more clarity of how companies can take responsibility for that. And how. So in the role, therefore, the voluntary carbon market. So the voluntary carbon market becomes like a mean to an end, which basically take full responsibility for your emissions.
And Adele, is that the right lever? I mean, certainly that's an important lever. Is that the right one? And what other levers do we have to sort of drive this demand?
So I'm thinking of course from a different lens, from a buyer or a corporate perspective, and definitely, I think there is a need of aligning incentives, right? It needs to be not just the right thing to do, but in a way needs to be linked to delivering of targets, or or as Tim was saying, it needs to be where everyone is going, so that more companies, will be enabled to build that business case and not to be the unique, outlier. So that's number one. I also want to recognize that a lot is being done. ICVCM, VCMI, defining what quality and integrity means, and then defining what you can say about that are two incredibly important things. So I think, a lot is already being done, and we should, enable that, pilot, test all of these new things and participate, right? And I think that maybe the last reflection from me is that one thing I'm really looking forward to is hearing more from the projects, from the local communities about the benefits. I think that's something that we hear still very little. What is in our head, especially in the corporate world, are the negative news
Mm.
that almost paralyze action. And I think there is so much positive news. And I really think if we think about a way to actually lift that, to elevate all these fantastic stories, the real stories of the benefits, I think that could also unlock action together with incentives and guidelines.
Yeah, so true. Absolutely. And I think NCS Alliance is doing some of that work, and others are as well. Tim, over to you. I know you also mentioned regulation here in Europe. That's also important. Maybe we can, and also we had some in the US, not regulation, but announcements.
Yeah. Exactly. As governments realize the magnitude of this crisis, and I still think most governments, most companies, even most people haven't realized how dangerous this situation is for all of humanity. The more governments realize that, the more regulation there will be. And we're starting to see some of that now, but there's a way to get ready for that for companies. And one of them is public-private partnerships, to engage in functioning platforms where you say, what can we do now? Because if you wait for the perfect regulation, that will take a long time or it will never come. But there are things you can do now, looking forward into what the regulatory environment is. And that is clearly moving towards more investments into carbon markets, whether they still be called voluntary at the point or not. But there's going to be more investments in carbon markets. Building public-private partnerships is something that everybody talks a lot about, but it's very rare to see them work in practice. And LEAF is one of those that has been built with both the private sector, the governments, but importantly, the indigenous communities, civil society in mind from the outset. So I think that's a real powerful starting point for scaling these investments.
And can I add, sorry, just spark a thought, but from a pure business perspective, that is also what makes financial sense, to start early. If you know that some of this will come, being in 5 years or 10 years, if you start now, you're anticipating the market. You really, you're learning. You don't need to get in 10 years' time when maybe it's perfect, but then you're completely exposed to price fluctuation. So there are so many also, business arguments to really do something.
Thank you. So I want to invite questions. Maybe I'll just add to that. So organizations, people really respond to incentives, and there are lots of different incentives, carrots and sticks that are placed on companies and others. And I think we should keep those in mind, that it's not only about regulation. Regulation is an important one, but the positive story is an important one. Recruiting and retaining employees is an important story, right? So there are lots of levers we should be thinking about. So welcome back, Mark.
I'm back.
I think we had a question, Tony.
Very interesting conversation, and I agree with much of the sentiments from this panel. For better or worse, as Aaron knows, I've been investing in companies that do climate change stuff since 1989, north of $10 billion in the space. One of the larger guys have done this for a really long time. This is the fifth boom bust cycle I've been involved in voluntary markets. So I was 6'6", blonde and good looking when I started investing in climate change. I think the big question at the end of the day is what's going to make this cycle different than the last 5 cycles? And the numbers of C-suite executives have come to me in the most recent downdraft. And my last name starts with a G, so they probably got through A to G before they called me. The amount of fear and concern, and I'm sure you deal with that at your shop, is what did we do? Why did we do it? Who do we do it with? And what is this? And stop doing it until I understand it better, because I'm experiencing a lot of downdraft. I'm intermittent. I'm in the intermediate period. I'm very interested in the future. I'm very concerned about the next 36 months, right? There's no other option. So you got me. Hello, I did my master. I'm good. The issue is how do we get from here to there? So given the expertise, especially of the BCMI, et cetera, how do we reestablish that basis for trust? And also, I think the friction cost in the market is one of its biggest problems. It's a market full of people pretending to be principals, agents, lawyers, and consultants, and that sucks the lifeblood out of the underlying asset. And it makes it difficult for the underlying asset to achieve what you really wanted to do, or to your point, the open architecture, show the goodness of whatever that is. And yet the fee structure is so high, right? 14% aside, it actually creates a problem. So I think the question is, how do we get more integrity, And how do we get the fee, the friction costs associated with actually engaging in these transactions lower so people engage more with those? Over to you guys.
I think we're going to collect some more questions. I'll let you, Craig, figure out where we go next. But Tony, proving our point that we've got an audience stacked with expertise, so eager to hear.
Hi, thanks. I've got a question about the role that companies have in the cause of deforestation. So forest carbon credits clearly have a place. Do you think companies are also looking at whether their status quo is a cause of deforestation in terms of acquisition of materials, forest clearance for infrastructure, or the food-based system, which are part of the causes of deforestation? Are companies in parallel also talking about reduction that way?
Yeah, thanks. I think we've got Esben.
Yeah, thanks. Esben Brandy from Timnan Investment Group. I might put Adele and on the spot here, but looks like a lot of the forward-looking firms that are starting investing, or not investing, but buying carbon credits are doing it from some place of corporate cost perspective, which is great. But what you also said is that we need to start early and we need to invest for future, because if and especially with nature, as you all said, you need to do something now, and then only in the future will you get emission reductions or removals, either project. So how do we get more companies, or what's the impediments for getting more companies getting balance sheet allocation for nature investing?
Why don't we take two more? We've got two down there, one by the window and one right here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mansi. I'm from Kita. We do carbon insurance. And so my question is more surrounding integrity. And this is a follow-up question from the first one that you guys were asked. How do key investors, such as yourselves, interact with carbon ratings? What is your take on it? Do you think that is sufficient to establish integrity in the market? And if so, how would you recommend it be used by other entities such as yourselves?
Why don't we take one last one and then we'll.
Thank you so much. Hi, it's Lucy Shea from Futera. A couple of reflections on building trust and communications, and a question as well, which is for the geeks, of which I think we all could identify around that. The geeks around voluntary carbon markets and net zero, etc. I thought it's quite interesting. There's been a recent IKEA, for example, when relaunching their climate and nature goals, have done a disentanglement. So they've made their net zero targets one pillar, and then they're investing nature in another. And so in light of this issue we've got around trust and rebuilding that, it's important to recognize how far that we've come. I totally agree. Not trash talk where we've been, because that's what cuts through to the kind of the meta narrative. But I thought that was quite an interesting development to start to disentangle climate positive into net positive and then into nature-based investments. And the other piece I wondered about, and I'd love to get your views on, is when we think about that meta narrative and how we really have some issues with trust and transparency breaking through to journalists and the consumer narrative. What I've observed in working across private and philanthropy over the years is that actually it can be hard to get the funding at an individual business level to do the comms campaigns, to build the trust back up. But there could perhaps be a little bit of nudging if any of you have philanthropic foundations, philanthropic partners within your businesses to work together on that. I've seen that happen around transparency over the years, labor standards, etc. And it might just be a way, as we've got this galloping time frame of 36 months, to start getting a little bit of funding and energy into this a little bit more quickly. So love to hear what the panel would have to say about that as well.
Great, thank you. And I like the little pitch for the philanthropic funding. So why don't we pause here and then we'll take another 5. So I have what will make this cycle different. Mark, if you maybe would take that. And then the next one is role of companies in causing deforestation. Leave that open to you both. What's the impediment for companies to invest? Ideli, maybe you can address that. Integrity and carbon ratings to Tim, and then trust and communication. Maybe Julia, you might take that. So Mark, what do you?
So what will make this time different? So there are some good bases for it to be different, but there's still some work to be done. So what's different this time already is, well, without blowing our own trumpets too much, you have independent organizations that are quasi-regulators on the supply and the demand side of the market. That didn't exist before. There were an increasing number of standards. People didn't, one of the things that we often heard 2 or 3 years ago, this market's so fragmented. Well, I think it's less fragmented now. There are still lots of developers and lots of standards, but there are 2 meta standards, the ICVCM and VCMI, which provide pretty clear guidance, evolving, but clear guidance on what a good quality carbon credit looks like and what good quality use of carbon credits looks like. You've also got a lot of investment already in the system, creating sort of the market integrity piece, which is still emerging, but how companies should, greater knowledge on how companies should account for carbon credits, what ledgers they sit on, what, are there tax requirements and so on and so forth. So I think we're seeing that. We've learned, the other thing we have now is we've learned, we damn well should have done, we've learned a lot over the last 20 years. We have much better technology for monitoring and measurement. We have much better understanding of what the risks are. And I think, and this is something that several people have mentioned already, that we're converging on an idea of what good enough looks like. Remember, in this country, you can send someone to prison for the whole of their life because 12 people say beyond reasonable doubt they're guilty. Well, we should be looking at taking the same approach with carbon credits. Is this beyond reasonable doubt good enough? And then we continue to review and audit. And if it's not quite good enough, then we improve it, rather than say it's binary 0 or 1. What else do we need? Well, we need more governments to encourage. I would prefer sooner rather than later for this to all be regulated. And I'm pretty sure that within 5 to 10 years, the compliance market or the Paris markets and the voluntary carbon market will almost certainly converge. And I hope they converge around high standards. But in the short term, we had the US government make a statement of principles 3 weeks ago. I would like to see more governments doing that. I'd like to see in disclosure requirements. And it's interesting what Lucy said about sort of disentangling, that companies report not just we've done X, but X1, X2, X3, and X4.
Yeah.
Really clear about.
Nobody can hear.
No one can hear you.
No one can hear you.
But yes, so that you are encouraged to disclose what you're doing, both in the use of carbon credits. But I think beyond that push from regulators and governments, companies, and I know it's a tough ask, but need to be braver about saying what they're doing. I mean, we've gone from a stage where companies were accused of talking a lot and doing very little. Now I think there are companies, and 2 on the stage here, who are doing a huge amount and perhaps aren't shouting it from the rooftops as much as they might do, because it's a scary, risky place to be. And we need to come together and support those who are doing the right thing and show that there's a business case as well as a social value from doing so.
But I would just add and build on top of that. I think what makes this cycle different is the involvement of governments in voluntary carbon markets, which we really haven't seen historically, whether it's putting real skin in the game, like with the Leaf Coalition, or importantly, the U.S. announcement a few weeks ago around voluntary carbon markets. It's my view, right, that if we really believe that this market needs to scale and needs to be taken seriously, it can't be regulated by NGOs. Ultimately, the program implementation needs to move into government agencies, even if it remains a voluntary program. Governments, at least in the US, governments run voluntary programs quite often. And I think it's time for them to consider the program implementation piece of voluntary carbon markets. And I think that then de-risks to a large degree some of this corporate participation. Okay, role of companies in cause of deforestation. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can start. What a brilliant question. And I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely. We do think about that a lot, and everybody should. Ultimately, if you're avoiding deforestation through carbon market, it's the same argument of reducing emissions and buying carbon credits, right? If you're just investing in avoided deforestation type of credit, but then your supply chain is causing deforestation, something is clearly going wrong. I actually hear a lot of companies now that are really trying to understand where their commodities come from and to make sure that deforestation does not happen. There are a lot of amazing initiatives, SBTN, TNFD, a lot is developing in the nature space, and we definitely have a no deforestation target for 2030. It's difficult because, of course, if you think about our very complex value chain, actually the commodity we buy from land are a very small percentage of the total. So actually our influence and even the accessibility that we have to data, is really nowhere near where we would like it to be, but we're working really hard with the industry, with other partners to make sure that we really understand that. And then wherever we don't know yet, we're also thinking about combining some of the investments with, with the areas where we know our commodities come from while we dig deeper into full traceability, point of interface with nature, etc. So it definitely should be.
While you have the mic, and since you mentioned investments, maybe there was another question on impediments to investment. Why aren't companies investing more into nature now?
Yeah, again, very good point. And I think we have talked about external incentives to help you build a business case. So I'm not going to go over that. And tell me if that doesn't answer, but I was thinking about what worked for us. And so I'll share that, hoping that might help. But what worked for us was two things. First, governance. What was so powerful for us was once we build the business case, actually we need to invest in the voluntary carbon market and why, we really brought that to the top of the house in the company. So we set specific targets. We aligned some of those targets with executive pay. We built, internal KPIs, and we built a governance, like a specific governance to approve capital investments, to make decisions, because this is nowhere near any investment we've ever done. So the first, it's very different. We didn't have any skills, and we will never be the experts, right? But what we can do is make sure that we set a target, we set a pathway to get there, and we enable the company to have the tough conversation, to ask the questions, so governance, I think it was really fundamental for us to unlock that capital decision and to make those at times competitive decisions around where is it that you invest your capital as a big company. The second point is having the tough conversations, because I think, and that will depend if you buy from the spot market, if you invest in early stage, there are so many options, but you need to really explain to, senior people, the board at times, what is at risk here? And you can't shy away from that. I think you really need to empower them to understand, to make sure that they can help you and then keep on track of the promise that you're making. So I think for us, the governance on one side, and then the honesty of, the update of the market, the risks, and having those conversations around the level of risk we're willing to accept in each deal, it has been what has unlocked ultimately the signature and then the money flowing.
Tim, maybe coming to you with the same question, if you also want to address the ratings question around ratings integrity.
Yeah, and I think those questions are also linked because ratings can help you to navigate this complex space. And for full disclosure, Salesforce is an investor in Silvera, which is one of the rating agencies. Tiny startup a few years ago, now a company of quite some size that is doing very well. So obviously they have a role to play. For our carbon credit purchasing, we have subscriptions with Silvera, with Calyx Global, and with B0. We funnel projects through them, whatever is top of that list. We then do our own due diligence on it. So it's quite the process. And I wish we wouldn't have to do all that. I think in future, we want to move to something that has higher quality off the shelf. That doesn't exist yet, mostly because the supply is too small, but also because the quality and the standards have been improving. So, but we see that the supply is picking up both in quality and in quantity. One quick point on the impediments for investing. I think that complexity of investing in the VCM, but also investing in, we, for example, also make philanthropic investments in nature. It is a complex space. There is a Business Alliance for Scaling Climate Solutions with the difficult acronym of BASCs, and we're doing like a 2-day boot camp for purchasing carbon credits for fellow companies. If anybody's interested in that, please let me know. It's complex, but it's not. But so are so many other things that we do as companies, right? It's easy once you have committed to do it, because then it's just a question of finding the right resources, allocating the right team and the right budget, and then it can be done.
Right. And Julie, I know you wanted to come in on the previous question, but also if you wanted to
Yeah.
address the last one on
Yeah, I love to
trust.
give an input on everything. So I'll be short, but I want to cover a few things. First of all, on the need to, when we're talking about avoided deforestation and carbon market, yes, it's the most important thing is to first see how you actually abate your own impact, right? What you are doing as a company to avoid your own deforestation. We have a program called Forest Finance Risk Consortium, which is financed through the U.S. State Department, that really looks into this to understand what are the tools, but also how do we enable financial institutions to ask the right questions and have portfolios that are forest, risk-free. What was interesting is one of the first output was to kind of have an overview of what are all the tools that companies can use. There are plenty of tools. So now we are at the point, it's not about creating new tools, it's to get companies to have an incentive to use them. So we're going back to the incentive question, and maybe help them identify which are the tools. So we are working with Global Canopy, for example, in the next year to provide a roadmap for companies that come from different places to really understand what is their risk of deforestation in their own value chain and which tools they can use, but really bringing together all the actors that have already worked in this. So we are not creating anything new. We just now have to somehow elaborate what is already there and make it available to companies. So, but it's true that if you're talking about avoided deforestation, that's the most first important thing is look into your own value chain, look at your supply chains, making sure that you do not purchase anything like that has an impact. In terms of, just wanted to highlight the investor-buyer roles, we see them as different and, however, very complementary. Investors will look at buyers to understand, is there going to be a future market for what I'm investing in? And what is very interesting is that the Forest Investor Club that brings together investors in the NCS Alliance that brings together buyers now have brought them together into a joint group that looks at how do we influence policies that look at specifically demand policy, but investors are super interested in that because, of course, the future, return on investment will depend on that. So, but on the other side, investing in NCS projects is quite a different task. So we are working with ERM. We have done almost a year looking at all the different specific elements that an NCS project investment, so we are talking about investment due diligence for buyers is a different level here where it's, the things that you have to look into, it's extremely complex, but it's possible. I think the whole question is investors need to be aware that this asset is an asset that comes with people attached to it, right? So you're investing in places that have people, that have different governance, they have different issues. And so we have gone through a very interesting journey to explain how investing in NCS for the carbon market is different, but special and is worth investing in. So happy to talk about that later.
Thank you. We have maybe 5 minutes left. If everybody promises to keep their questions to 30 seconds or less, it's going to be the rapid fire last round of the game show. We do 5 more quick questions, 30 seconds or less. I'll be disciplined in cutting people off, and also a quick answers.
I just, while the mics are going, there was a question about all the transaction costs and all the money that intermediaries are taking out of the system, and that has been a wide concern, and there have been pieces of research that have showed how much or isn't being taken out. The challenge I've just put out there, though, is we are asking large, sophisticated multinational corporations and financial investors to invest in projects run by small communities in faraway areas, and we're expecting perfection, high credit ratings, perfect assurance, perfect validation verification, and it's hard to square the circle. And that is one of the things. I'm not saying that's a reason not to deal with that challenge, that problem, because it's a big problem, but that's where our collective creativity needs to come in. How do we cut out some of the rent that's been taken out of the system so more goes to the local communities and there's more money for the projects, while at the same time maintaining the levels of assurance and verification that large companies and financial institutions require?
I would just say there is a role there for philanthropy and government
Indeed.
funders, right?
Exactly.
And there's quite a bit of that money around, but we need more. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the panel. I'm Suelen Maroshka from Brazil. I work for the Talanoa Institute. And my question is about how to price all the benefits for biodiversity and the communities that comes attached to carbon credits generated from forest, and make it more attractive to buyers and investors, because we have different efforts and then different costs to produce a carbon like this. And in a global connected world where some discussions about having a unique price for the carbon credit, it's a good solution.
Got it. Thanks. We've got a few more back there.
I have a mic, so
Oh.
maybe I'll jump in.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Amy Lors from Microsoft, and thanks for a great panel. The question I have actually follows on a couple of the last comments, is how people are thinking about the nature agenda and the climate agenda. This has really been focused in the context of climate, some discussion about other things, but we're of course at a time when companies are beginning to think about what their nature agenda is. And of course, COP16, the biodiversity COP, is coming up, and there's a lot of issues about corporate role in biodiversity issues. And I'm just wondering, as we move forward, do we have the structures in place to be able to have people thinking about investing in nature in a way that's holistic enough to address our sustainability challenges? And how do the companies and the voluntary, the carbon market integrity institutions think about how we're creating those incentives, standards, and rules to ensure that we're investing in high integrity ecosystem functions? And so yeah, 30 seconds, I'm probably over.
Thank you. Good question.
Hi, question for Mark. We talked about incentives quite a lot this morning. And obviously VCMI is part of that, trying to create the incentives. But do you think that the claim, the way that it's set up is enough to create those incentives? What is it in what's in it for a company that makes a VCMI claim ultimately?
Right.
Hi, I'm Brina Griffin from BirdLife International, and we're developing a few RED projects around. So this is a question about nesting, and it's really interesting. You were talking a little bit about jurisdictional project and nested projects, and this is kind of a question about how we can make sure that as companies like this are investing in early stage projects, that then they are not sort of invalidated by the development of jurisdictional programs, which we have seen in a couple of places. So how can we have confidence when we're asking companies to invest at really early stages that then the jurisdictional programs don't essentially undervalue or essentially cancel out the projects that are being developed? Thanks.
Right. Maybe two more? 1, 2.
So I enjoyed the comment on frictional costs, having been a banker myself for many years, who really like frictional costs. But I think maybe the more important piece here is frictional speed. High integrity is super important, but do we need to think about something structurally different to draw more capital in sooner, rather than having routine 12-month due diligence processes, etc.?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Ben Cohen. I lead the Forest Investor Club at WBCSD. My question is mostly for Aaron. I was curious, I think the kinds of offtake commitments that you've achieved through the LEAF Coalition and particularly having the donor governments being the buyer of last resort, that sounds a powerful market signal to help improve the bankability of jurisdictional activities. But I know that, often there's still an upfront capital gap that needs to be solved. So I was curious to learn more about how you see the need and the opportunity of particularly private sector investment coming in to really help scale those activities in a jurisdictional approach. Thanks.
Great question. We only have one hand left, so we'll just grab that last question and I think what we'll do is we'll just go down the line one time and just answer whichever questions you are so
You
inspired.
remember. You remember.
Hello, I'm
All right.
Nilesh. I'm from Calculus Carbon, a temasek portfolio company helping raise financing for large-scale projects in Southeast Asia, nature-based projects. This is for Julia in particular. So I was curious about, there's a debate that we see for ongoing projects about harvestation in particular. So a lot of projects, particularly forest projects, have a stream of revenue coming from, harvestation of sap, coconut, like, different ecosystem services, which somehow creates a debate around additionality of the project. How do you evaluate that? And for some of the buyers it's a definite no-go, for some of them it's a debate. How do you look at it?
Yeah.
Great questions. Why don't we go down the list and answer whichever ones you're so inspired. So just to remind everyone what the questions were. So we have the question about pricing co-benefits. That actually, I think, in some ways is linked to the next question, which is around nature, the nature and climate agenda. Do we have, and biodiversity, do we have the structures in place? The third one was about VCMI. Is that sufficient? Is that enough? The fourth is around nesting and the validation of projects. What else can we do for speed? Obviously, speed being super important. How do we address the upfront capital gap? And then the last one about additionality.
Great set of questions. Price and nature. And again, I'll talk about from the corporate perspective, right? It's a brilliant question, and I don't think I have an answer for you. But what I can tell you is that we really look for projects that deliver, biodiversity, nature, climate, and people's benefit as much as possible and feasible and appropriate. And we give a price, a surplus, let's say, in our price range that we have internally to those types of projects. Actually, we only look for those at the moment. So we do recognize that there is a price differentiation, and that will, it's due to the fact that you need maybe different monitoring systems or, more investments up front to capture and maximize, if possible, for different outcomes. So yeah, we definitely try our best to send the signal from a demand perspective, recognizing that there is a price differentiation. That's our way of hopefully helping some of those projects. And I think on the nature point, what a brilliant question. I don't know if we have the system to actually really maximize or maximize the two topics. From our perspective, we have been strong advocate of really looking at your climate and your nature strategy in conjunction. The two coins, just two sides of the same coin. You cannot achieve net zero without nature investments. And while you invest in nature, absolutely look to deliver your nature commitments and to really looking holistically. It's not easy, to give you an example. We started in 21. We looked at more than 90 projects. No one really was looking at nature or, quantifying. Things are changing. Now there is a lot of brilliant things out there. So yeah, again, what we can do is send those demand signals, show that there are money available now for projects that are ambitious to really tackle all the different elements. And yeah, that's what we can do for now.
Yeah, so just to add, I have, being in the NCS Alliance and speaking to a lot of companies, I have the opportunity to listen to other companies and what they do. So this idea of having a minimum internal price for how much they would pay is also common in other companies. What we have done in the NCS Alliance when we issued our guidance for procurement was to be very clear, saying, if you have a limited budget, prioritize the buying high quality, so spending more per credit rather than volume, because we just wanted to say that the most important thing is the quality, even, and you will have to pay a premium. And here we are always talking about credits that actually have the biodiversity and social element in it, because that's a fundamental definition of an NCS credit. So it has to have climate mitigation, biodiversity gains, and social benefits. So it's clear, our core message is that you have to, it's better to buy less, but buy high quality. And we do have a lot of opportunities for companies that have joined the NCS Procurement Hub to see projects, right? That we were talking about things that happen on the ground, a multinational, they're thousands of kilometers away. And what we are trying to do is bring project developers and communities to the to the buyers to show them and actually have a chat. So we have regular clinics where we have last week, sorry, I was with our colleagues from Tanzania, and they were from their project in the call with corporates buying, just to explain what they're doing. Now, the next thing is go and visit this project. So obviously that will be great. On the question on additionality, so I think the additionality discussion at ICVCM was extremely challenging, but I am personally supportive of the conversation, of the principle. The funding that comes through the voluntary carbon market has to demonstrate to go to places where other funding will not go. Otherwise, we are just shifting money around. Mm-hmm. This is about creating new finance. Now, for agriculture is a huge challenge because they have other revenues. And so what I'm saying is there are a lot of methodologies now looking at, that being evaluated for that. And part of it is the additionality for use methodology for agriculture, where there is already another source of revenue, but is not maybe a constant source of revenue. So I would really suggest that you contact ICVCM Secretariat to understand, which methodology are being evaluated and how to get into that conversation, knowing that ICVCM is not set in stone. There is a continuous improvement program for, to continuously revise also the core carbon principles and the assessment framework, specifically when we see that certain things didn't really work well the first round, and there is going to be an opportunity of revising. But definitely the agriculture is a great opportunity. We know that the carbon sequestration and reduction from managed land is the biggest contribution that we can have. So really important to have these methodologies also approved.
So quickly on pricing and biodiversity, landfill gas projects cost much less than nature-based solutions projects. And in a way, that is already pricing in some of the co-benefits. Of course, there should be an adequate price for holistic carbon credits that have benefits for people, climate, and nature. But they are more expensive than other carbon credits already. On the nature financing gap, UNEP's last report on the state of finance for nature said there's about a $200 billion a year finance gap for nature. I think the VCM will not fill that, but importantly, it will catalyze and pilot how we can invest. Most of those investments will be domestic infrastructure once we realize that nature is critical infrastructure. And just a very quick story from Brazil on that. I'm on a working group on the advisory board of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, where we're looking into the Atlantic rainforest and how to finance the 1 million hectares of restoration there. It costs about $6 billion. Where's that money going to come from? But if you look into all the ecosystem services, from water to agroforestry investments, it's actually fairly easy to generate, and there are channels from different sources for making investments at that level. Sao Paulo State, for example, when they were running out of water a couple of years ago and facing day X, where there would be no more drinking water, the city rolled out a massive river reforestation program. And this was not the carbon money. It was not development assistance. It was the Sao Paulo State government, and 20 million people were running out of water. So they frankly also didn't really care what it cost. They just did it. And I think the more we realize we need nature for flood protection, for drought protection, for drinking water, for our food, for everything, the more there will be these kinds of massive infrastructure investments, and the VCM can pave the way for that. That's why it's so important we invest now.
Yeah, maybe I'll address the nature and biodiversity thing. Look, I think we need, just like we have a mitigation hierarchy, I think we need a hierarchy of carbon credit purchasing, right? And I think at the top of that needs to be protecting and restoring nature for a lot of the reasons. I won't repeat the reasons that Julia mentioned. And because I'm also, let's say, bearish on the role of, let's say, biodiversity credits or payments for other ecosystem services will play, at least in a global scale. In isolated instance, in certain jurisdictions where we've got the regulatory environment, where you've got an example like Sao Paulo, yes. But globally, I've invested in a biodiversity project in 2012. Very hard, very, very hard to think about the demand profile scaling globally. So I think we need to use carbon. Unfortunately, we use carbon as a proxy, and I think we need to elevate nature, and I think kudos to the work that NCS Alliance and others are doing, elevate nature to the top of that hierarchy list, and you should be willing to pay more and prioritizing those types of investments. The need for upfront capital in LEAF specifically. We're in the process of basically building a market for jurisdictional RED plus. The idea of JRED is not new. It's been around for almost 20 years, but it's largely been a publicly financed, right, from donor governments to forest governments. What we're trying to do is create the private demand pool. There's still a bit of a gap between the, let's say, the cost of capital expectations, the risk expectations between private investors and the host jurisdictions. So I think anything that what needs to be done there needs to be a concessional capital piece and blended finance piece. And so we're doing some of that at Emergent. We've launched sort of a pilot advanced payment facility to pave the way. Ultimately, we hope that other investors can, play a role, but we think it's a process to get there.
So 3 very quick comments. First, I know it's childish, but I really want to give a shout out to the person from BirdLife who asked a question about nesting. I'm still chuckling, sorry. Second, I think one thing that's important is, while it is difficult to value the different benefits, one of the challenges you've had for many years is this sort of intellectual and political separation between mitigation and adaptation. 30 years ago, I lived in Ecuador, was trying to do projects that restored mangroves, which had adaptation benefits and clearly carbon benefits. And the mitigation funders said, oh, the adaptation bit, we can't cover that. And the Global Environment Facility at the time, which funded adaptation, said, oh, well, if you're getting carbon revenues, that's not our bag. And we've got better at it, but we still haven't got good enough at it. And we need those holistic approaches. Finally, going to your question, Chris, does VCMI's claims code provide enough of incentive? Clearly not. It's a starting point. If we think when we were set up, and I wasn't there then 3 or 4 years ago, there was this concern that we were going to have a thousands and billions of dollar market and everyone was going to go crazy. There was going to be all sorts of greenwashing, and VCMI was set up to stop people cheating. Now we're sort of trying to get people, come on, not saying please cheat, but please come back to the market. So we've got a claims code which is a high bar. I think the things that are really needed are, one, and this is something, Chris, you've said yourself, companies' emissions need to be seen as a liability, so you have to take responsibility for them. We need policy, and we need that convergence between the voluntary market and the compliance market. We need, as I said before, companies to stand up and talk about it, but importantly, as long as carbon credit investments are seen as a philanthropic gesture or CSR, that is not going to be enough. Now, we know that there are 7,000 or 8,000 companies around the world who have science-based targets. And kudos to them, because there are 332 million companies in the world, and apart from those 8,000, very few of them have any targets at all. But we also know that 70% of those countries, or close to 70% of those companies, are not going to meet their targets in 2030. So I go back to what I said in my opening remarks. Do we then go, well, it's a shame, isn't it? You tried. Or do we say, no, you've got to take responsibility for that underachievement, and here is a way to do so by investing in high-integrity carbon credits. So once we change our mindset, we say we push companies to do everything they can, recognize that there are sometimes structural barriers, some reasons they can't get as far as they should do, and then the obligation is to fill that gap with carbon credits, then we'll drive real demand.
Thank you. And if you unlock that finance, and this will just be the closing remarks, and I know we've got some coffee and whatnot waiting, but if we unlock that new finance really at scale, which has been the promise for I don't know how many years, what do we do with it? And I want to come back to first principles where we started, was we have an opportunity here to actually reverse deforestation, right? This is a question of incentives. It's a question of finance. And shame on us if we don't get this done, because we have a unique opportunity. Once these forests are lost, they're not coming back, right? So the time really is now to do this. So I would posit to you all that the highest and best use of carbon finance, if we can, whatever we have now and whatever we can unlock, is to protect the world's forests and the world's ecosystems. And so that's what we're trying to do. We are looking, for funding support. We're looking for corporates to join into the LEAF Coalition, and we're very partner-oriented. We've got some other members of the Emergent team in the audience, so if you have questions about Emergent or LEAF, maybe you guys can raise your hand. So feel free to direct your questions to one of them. Thank you so much for joining us. Tim, thank you, and Salesforce for hosting us. Julia, NCS Alliance, Deli, thanks for joining. And we will have coffee and some maybe cakes or something And we'll take that nesting question offline. Thank you, everyone.
Done. Hi, everyone. Just to say, we were expecting to have a light lunch, but it's been slightly delayed. So if you'll bear with us, it'd be great if you could stick around, have a chat, that kind of thing. And Julia, did you want to say anything about the rest of the NCSA program for the rest of the week?
Yes, actually, yes. If you are staying in London, there are a few more events organized by the Natural Climate Solution Alliance. You can scan. Some of these sessions might already be at the capacity, but you can contact me or Yenica here. And the other thing is, as we were talking about critical mass, we have the NCS Procurement Hub, which is designed for companies that want to learn in a very secure space, free for to access. Is just an opportunity to get to know the issues related to NCS carbon credits and meet project developers. So again, Yenica is there and I'm here, and thank you so much to Salesforce for hosting us, and happy coffee.